Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel, where we dive deep into the most pressing political stories shaping South Africa and the African continent. Today, we are turning our attention to a powerful and deeply reflective statement from former South African President Thabo Mbeki, one that has sent ripples through African political circles and reignited old wounds from one of the most controversial and tragic episodes in modern African history, the 2011 NATO-led intervention in Libya and the brutal death of Muammar Gaddafi. Speaking from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, ahead of the Thabo Mbeki annual lecture, the former president didn't mince his words. His message was direct, haunting, and impossible to ignore. We must never, never, never again allow a situation where an African country is invaded. Those weren't just poetic reflections, they were a warning. A warning drawn from hard experience, from regret, and from the painful realization that Africa played a hand in its own betrayal. Mbeki was referring, of course, to the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya, an operation that was justified on the surface as a humanitarian effort but which ultimately led to the destruction of a sovereign African state, the murder of its leader, and the ongoing collapse of Libyan society. A once stable, albeit autocratic, nation reduced to warring militias, slave markets, and complete political disarray. The tragedy of Libya is not a distant memory. It is a living consequence. One that Mbeki believes Africa must never allow to happen again, and certainly never again with African complicity. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Mbeki specifically called out 3 African countries, South Africa, Nigeria, and Gabon. These nations, in 2011, were non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. When Resolution 1973 was tabled, authorizing a no-fly zone over Libya and giving NATO and its allies the green light to intervene, all 3 African nations voted in favor. Let's be clear, this wasn't just a technical vote. It was a green light for regime change. And that decision, according to Mbeki, directly paved the way for the violent toppling of Gaddafi's government. The consequence of that was the murder of Muammar Gaddafi, Mbeki lamented. To this day, Libya is still in a mess. He's not wrong. Libya has not had a stable central government since Gaddafi's death. The country has been divided between rival governments and militias, with foreign powers meddling for influence and oil. It has become a transit hub for human trafficking and a breeding ground for extremism. So, how did we get here? And why did Africa help NATO destroy one of its own? Back in 2011, the Arab Spring was in full swing. Protests had erupted in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Libya. The world was watching, and Western powers, led by France, the UK, and the United States, were eager to insert themselves into what they framed as a democratic revolution. In Libya, the protests quickly escalated into an armed rebellion. Gaddafi, known for his fiery rhetoric and harsh crackdown on dissent, responded with brute force. The West saw an opportunity, and used the language of protecting civilians to justify intervention. But we now know that regime change was the true goal. Resolution 1973, the infamous UN document, called for all necessary measures to protect civilians. But it was vague. Too vague. And NATO took that vagueness and ran with it. What followed was a relentless bombing campaign. Over 26,000 sorties were flown. Gaddafi's convoy was attacked by NATO jets in Sirte. Moments later, he was dragged out of a drain pipe and beaten to death by rebels. And what about Africa's role in all this? That's the crux of Mbeki's warning. He believes African leaders failed the continent. By voting for Resolution 1973, countries like South Africa not only failed Libya, they failed the African Union. They failed Pan-Africanism. They failed the principle of African solutions to African problems. The African Union had its own roadmap for peace. Mbeki himself, alongside other AU leaders, had worked on a plan that included a ceasefire, political dialogue, and reforms within Libya, without resorting to foreign bombs. But that roadmap was ignored. Marginalized. Dismissed by NATO and its allies. And, tragically, not strongly defended by Africa's own representatives at the UN. Mbeki's speech in Tanzania wasn't just about Libya. It was about African sovereignty. About the danger of being drawn into global power struggles. About how Africa must learn from its past mistakes to avoid becoming a pawn in geopolitical chess games. His warning comes at a time when Africa is once again under pressure. From the militarization of the Sahel, to the growing presence of foreign mercenaries, to resource-hungry global powers vying for influence, from the US and France to China and Russia, Africa is being courted, cajoled, and coerced. And history tells us, when Africa doesn't stand united, others will decide its fate. Mbeki's speech also touches on a broader issue, the failure of multilateralism when it comes to African interests. The United Nations Security Council has long been criticized for being dominated by the Permanent Five: China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US, leaving Africa with little real influence despite making up 54 member states of the UN. The Libya episode is a stark example of how Africa's voice can be manipulated or ignored entirely. Even when it speaks through official channels, like the AU, it often lacks the power to enforce its positions. So, what do we take from this? First, Mbeki's words are not just a historical critique. They're a call to action. A call for African nations to develop independent foreign policies. A call to prioritize African unity over Western approval. A call for stronger regional institutions that can resist outside pressure and mediate internal conflicts effectively. Second, his speech raises urgent questions for current leaders. Would today South Africa vote differently? Would Nigeria or Gabon? Or are our leaders still too beholden to foreign interests to defend the continent's long-term stability? And third, it's a reminder to all of us, not just leaders but citizens, journalists, scholars, and youth, that we must remain vigilant. That we must study history. That we must question foreign interventions, even when they're cloaked in the language of human rights. Because Libya is more than just a country in chaos. It's a warning. A wound. And a symbol of what happens when Africa fails to stand for itself. So as Thabo Mbeki urged from that podium in Tanzania, let this be the last time. Let Libya be the last sacrifice. Let Africa never again be complicit in the destruction of one of its own. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Should African nations have done more to stop the Libya invasion? Has Africa learned its lesson, or is history doomed to repeat itself? See you next time.